Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And today we're talking about Transit.
Yes.
Which is a German film written and directed by Christian Petzold, based on a 1944 novel by Anna Seghers,
yes.
or Seghers, set in 1942 the novel was, but this is set in the present day.
No.
Well...
No. I mean, that's one of the things we have to discuss, because the film is really set in 1942. I mean, it's when the German occupation... when the Germans occupy... The film begins when the day the Germans occupy Paris. Right? So, now, the whole thing is that the way that it's filmed is filmed as if it isn't a historical film. So, everything you're told is historical. What you're shown is more mixed. It's like, they haven't changed the cars, they haven't changed the clothes, but then there are also things like, a 1930s typewriter, right? So the director is clearly playing with time. He wants what is happening in the film to have resonance with refugees, and migrants now, right? So he's making a connection between the past and the present, but the action is very much set in the past.
Right, well, I mean, the way the timeline seems to me, there's a very ambiguous opening scene, because all you see, you mainly get close-up shots of these two guys at the bar,
yes.
which kind of starts the action off. And so I'm thinking, they talk about the Germans having occupied Paris, which is where they are, but the clothes they're wearing seem a little too modern. And then you're hearing ambulances outside, and you see one or two shots of cars going by, and they are modern cars.
Yes.
And so... you're right, it starts to play on your perceptions. And to be fair, though, the way that I took it overall was that when you did see something that was old, an old radio or an old typewriter or an old... a lot of the luggage that people use is very large, old, sort of big boxy suitcases. I did, I suppose, take that to mean that this was old stuff that had just lasted to the present day. But I think you're quite right that it is... it is allowing these sort of symbols of different times to mix very fluidly.
Everything that you are told, or even that the characters say, is definitely referring to German occupation.
Yeah, and it is left vague.
Some things are quite explicit, though, because one of the ways that the film tells its story is it reads or it narrates excerpts of the original book, and there's a narrator as well who so aspects of her book are being read, kind of certain things are being told, so kind of there's this layering of events, but the German occupation is very clear, right? So it's set in Paris. He's asked to deliver some secret papers, to this famous writer. The woman who opens the door basically tells him about, how the German, how she's keeping her hotel open in spite of the German occupation. All of that dialogue is very specific. This is it. The way that they escape Paris, you're meant, it's kind of again meant to refer to that. The waiting around in Marseille, all of that is historical. And in fact, I was very interested to read that the novelist, who's the lady who wrote the book?
Anna Seghers.
Was in fact, waiting around Marseille, waiting for her transit papers with Walter Benjamin, the author, right? And, there's all these things about crossing the Pyrenees and, getting across the Pyrenees and escaping that way, which is, of course, what Benjamin died, only to die, I think he committed suicide. So...
The thing you say about the narration in the film, the voiceover narration... being actual excerpts of Seghers' book. Is that... I didn't know if is that actually the case?
Well, it is, though I'm not sure if it's always...
word perfect.
I'm not sure if there are times when the words are from the novel and other times when they're not. That some of the words are from the novel
is definitely true.
Is definitely true.
Okay, that's interesting.
Right, now the question is kind of, is that all the voiceover you hear, excerpts from the novel, or is there also something else?
Sure.
But I mean, kind of let's backtrack a little bit, because I think it's an amazing movie, and I was deeply moved And also, there were moments that I was on the edge of my seat, like, when he's talking to Marie, and you say, well, why don't you just say what you're doing, right? Like, yeah, and
can we quickly say what it's about?
Yeah.
Before we get into sort of deep territory, it's so let's kind of skip over the question of exactly when it's set, and it mixes elements of time periods, and it's about this guy. What's his name? Georg, played by Franz Rogowski, who we've actually seen once before in Happy End, the Haneke film. He is. You find out a little bit later, a radio and TV technician. He's just a guy, right? Who's German, living in Paris, and there is obviously...
And a Jew.
Well, is it clear that he's a Jew? Or does he
Anybody who's on the run there is a Jew.
Well, okay, well, that's certainly not made explicit, but that may well be the case. There was a question in my mind certainly about that. There is this fascist occupation of Germans in Paris, and it's making its way through France. He's given this a couple of letters by a journalist who he knows, who I think he owes money to anyway, to give to this writer, this famous writer called Weidel. He goes to the Weidel's hotel room, as you say, to give him this stuff. Turns out that he's killed himself, and he opportunistically takes what is Weidel, takes the stuff in his room, and goes to Marseille, where his wife has asked him to come. And Marseille is where people are leaving from. Okay,
let me backtrack now, and continue on from what you say, because it's important, I think. So, he doesn't just opportunistically take, the writer's things. The concierge of the hotel kind of asks him to take him, because basically... even this man's death is something that puts everybody in danger. I mean, he hasn't been killed by the Germans. He's committed suicide in this hotel. Just as the Germans kind of are moving in, there's blood everywhere. And all of a sudden, kind of, there's all these papers and, good luggage and so on. So she asks him to take it. The body has already been secretly disposed of. And then he returns back to, his mates. And... he's asked to transport someone to the mountains, right? And this man, has been very badly hurt. And in fact, what ends up happening is, after evading kind of the police and Nazis and so on, basically the guy dies, right? So then he's got to make a run from that, because they arrest other people kind of, who are also on the train. And then he makes it to Marseille. And in Marseille, he goes... and knocks on the door of the wife of the man who's just died on the train, right? And kind of meets his child and so on. Anyway, so this is the context in which he ends up in Marseille. And to me, it's very interesting because, there's a point of making the women Moroccan, or Maghreb. So all of these issues of people without papers, people in transit, people in danger, people on the run, kind of what exclusionary political policies lead to. They're being kind of, you're being specifically asked to make a connection between, Jews in 1942 or whatever it was, or 41 or 40, right? And every so often the film will tell you, they're being cleansed in Lyon, or Avignon is being cleansed, or it's approaching here, like they're only a day away, then we're going to be cleansed, right? So, so you're being asked to make an explicit kind of connection between that and the contemporary world. What's happening now, with people trying to sneak in borders in the US, or people waiting in ports like, Calais to kind of arrive in the UK, And actually, the film for me, if you make that connection, which I think the film explicitly asks you to do over and over again, then it becomes kind of this deeply moral and ethical and challenging film, because it's really asking you to say, well, what are you doing, right? Because we all have this thing of, when this was happening with the Jews, why didn't people do anything, right? Like, I would have done it or whatever. And actually, kind of the film asks you, well, what are you doing about what's happening now? Yes, because these situations that the film is showing, they're happening everywhere now, right? It isn't just something kind of relegated to the past.
Yeah, but I think what's kind of striking about the film is that it's set in quote unquote Western country,
Yes.
and you kind of don't imagine that happening in Western countries since the war, basically.
That's right, but that's the point. It's happening right now. I mean, it's maybe not happening, if you're a Frenchman, but it is happening if you're a Syrian trying to move south, trying to get away from a war zone, or kind of various Middle Eastern and North African peoples just kind of trying to escape, some situation where they will die if they remain. Right, that's very current, really.
But it's funny because remember when we talked about Casablanca way back when, start of the year, I think, and you were saying I think we were talking about if you made this film today, sort of, and you suggested, well, the way you would the story you would tell today is about people in the Middle East, people in North Africa, people in places where this is happening.
People from the Middle East were waiting in Calais to get passage, right, or to hide underneath a truck instead of like a moving train, or and actually I think this is what this film does. But
then the thing is this, although it places some priority on people of colour and people from those ethnic backgrounds, it still tells it's set in a slightly fantastical world, being that it says this is happening in modern France. This is and to white people, and and with an occupation. That's where it kind of, I think, is unusual, and that's where it's kind of striking.
Well, okay, so let's get this clear, because I think for me the film is not set in a modern time. It is set under the occupation, but what the film is telling you is also the occupation is now. It's a different kind of occupation. Right, but kind of people are facing these problems now. They're in this type of danger now. There are people kind of trying to get papers now. There are people kind of, being sent back to camps now. Right, so
But I think there's a metaphor. Like the thing is, there is not an occupation of France going on right now.
No, but there is in the film. That's why.
Right, but that's my point. That's where it is. It is taking this kind of taking a kind of sort of metaphorical leap or kind of imaginative leap to emphasise the points that it's making. It's doing so through metaphor. It's not doing so as if to say this is exactly happening now. That's where
fair enough.
Do you see what I mean? Like when I said earlier that it's striking that this is sort of happening in a Western country. It's happening in a country which has symbols of Westernness and to Western people, and that's what is kind of that's what is. So that's like say when you said if you were to make Casablanca today, you'd like to make it about this place where it is actually happening. That's the difference here. It's not actually happening in the way it is in the film here.
No, but the film makes so many allusions.
Yeah.
So for example, there's this thing about the ships that they hope to get to America with, the Montreal, right? And they have this huge cruise ship, which is like, what was it? Something Doria, the one that crashed in Italy.
The Costa Concordia.
The Costa Concordia. The film makes kind of explicit references to kind of contemporary situations. One of them is the way that they pictorialize the ship that is meant to take them to America, which is the Montreal. And kind of visually it's so similar to the Costa Concordia that kind of crashed on the shores of Italy, and how all of that was handled and what a scandal that was. And in fact, that illusion is doubled because the Montreal is also meant to have hit a mine and everyone in it kind of, there
are no survivors.
No survivors. So this mingling of the present, of the past, of the referencing of the past to the present, right? It's such an interesting thing that the film does. And, maybe we're giving a wrong impression because the film is about all of that, but at the center of it is also, kind of all these things about kind of love and belonging and different types of love and, the choices that situations put people in, and how people try to do the honorable thing and how they might also be selfish and, how often kind of doing the honorable thing exacts a price, and often that is someone's life. And, so I think all of those things, each character is in a way a slightly different commentary on that.
Yeah, so Georg, your main character, in Marseille, ends up finding and making a connection with Vidal's wife, Marie. Although I did have a problem with the idea that it took him so long to realise she was his wife. I mean, to be fair, it's a film, so I noticed it immediately.
Well,
and I kind of called it.
As soon as you see a beautiful woman looking back and her skin kind of disappearing, you think, who is that? Right? Like, must be.
So, granted, like, I was looking at it from someone, I'm watching a film, this person who's shown up must be important. I put it together straight away. It's fair enough that he wouldn't necessarily, but it did take him a very long time. And you were talking about that scene in the bedroom where she... this is the scene where he realises who she is. And she is telling him her story. And the thing is, he has by now assumed the identity of Vidal. In the eyes of sort of the Mexican and American consulates, assume the identity of Vidal. He is Vidal because he has the visa and travel documents that Vidal had in his possession. This allows him... He basically is able to leave. And it frustrated me, I suppose, that Georg didn't make the decision to be honest with Marie about who he was and what was happening.
Oh, I understood that perfectly, because to do so would have put him in immense danger, right? Like, who knows how she would react. I mean, yeah.
Well, that's true.
And also, there were emotional things, because the fact is that we find out that the wife wrote him a letter saying that she was leaving him, right? And in fact, that is what occasioned his suicide. That is why he killed himself. Aside from, kind of the Germans coming in, it was like, the receipt of this letter. So she is also responsible for his death. So, to both reveal his identity that would put him in great danger, potentially, whilst also kind of, so those are the choices of what do you reveal and how do you reveal it and when, Like, this is a film that ethically complicates all those issues.
Oh, certainly.
In a way that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and he does, at one or two points, attempt to communicate to her that her husband is dead. He says so to her, but without kind of backing it up with, and here's how I know, it comes across, I think, as more of a, you should forget about him and try and move on with your life sort of plea. Like with
me.
But it comes across as like a plea rather than information.
Or it comes across to her as something that is potentially, that is intending to reassure, though perhaps it's also intending to seduce, i.e., get over him, come with me, right? Yeah. He's dead, right? So this thing about misreadings is kind of interesting in the film as well. I mean, it takes a long time for the film to actually confirm, so the audience knows things the characters don't. We know that she's the writer's wife way before Georg does, right? So, the film kind of works on those different sets of knowledges, what the audience knows, what the characters knows.
If we have an ounce of intelligence, we do. It's not actually confirmed, I think, to the audience explicitly until that bedroom scene. Yeah. I don't think. But if you've been paying attention, you will have figured it out.
I mean, it would be very hard to miss, the woman, that moment where she flies out of the consulate and, searching left and right and then goes up to him. And,
well, the thing is,
you'd have to be like a real thicko.
You would, but that's I must say, that was something that initially was needling me at the start of that bedroom scene because I thought, is the film expecting me to find this a great revelation? Because I thought if it ends up with Georg saying, are you Marie? I know about your husband, blah, blah, blah. Then that's like actually really, that would be demeaning to the audience because it would be saying like, we have to confirm this for you now. The fact that it didn't in the end meant that I liked that scene more because it wasn't about revealing that information to us. It was about revealing his state of mind to us and his decision not to be honest with her. It was kind of the point of that scene more so than us discovering the truth. I was nervous about that at the start. I had a problem too with the narration, I think. Although, as you say, I didn't know that it was taken from the novel directly, or at least some of it was. I felt that it didn't add much. To me, it felt like it was filling in silences.
No, I loved it. And, because I loved it, because you think, well, for a while you think, who is knowing this, right? And there's like constant references to the writer and writing and telling and storytelling. And then there's that moment, where you're, the guy who works at the consulate asks, well, what is the last thing you wrote? And he cites, right, like the manuscript that he's got from the writer, right? So it's working on different levels, but it's also slightly unreliable. So you'll often say, he did this and cried, and then you're being shown the person's face and they're not crying.
Yeah,
right.
Yes, there were a few examples of that.
Yeah,
she shielded her eyes and she's not. He turned to look as he left and he doesn't.
Exactly, and that's quite deliberate, right? So I found that very interesting, kind of, that the narration seems slightly unreliable. It's not quite, the way what you're being told and what you're seeing are not, they're usually the same, but they're not always the same.
There's a kind of Chinese whispers between what actually happened, which you see, and what's being told, because it starts off, the start of the chain is what actually happened, then you have Georg telling the bartender. It turns out the bartender, where he or cafe owner, where he drinks and eats regularly, is the guy who's telling the story, who's narrating it. You find out at the end. So it's like from real life to Georg's perception to Georg's memories, or what Georg wants to tell in his version of the story, to what the bartender says. Yes. There are these areas where the story can be changed.
Yeah,
and people right. and what you would like the story to be can be replaced. Replaced. You can use that to replace what actually happened.
One of the things that I really loved about the film is the way that it uses all of these tropes, these cliches, even these images of France under the occupation, right? Like, so the character who runs the hotel at the beginning says, oh, I'm a French woman, I'm a real French woman, I'm a sucker for, anyone in love. Then actually you have, when he's running, there's a woman who immediately denounces him and says, he's there, right? Yeah. And, you can imagine how this might have taken place in France in 1942. Then there's the thing where he goes to a hotel, but, he's being extortioned, for money, right? In a way that he thinks she's going to denounce me tomorrow, right? This woman, and she does.
Yeah.
Right. So, all these.
Well, he doesn't think it. He knows it.
He knows
immediately.
Right. And actually, all of these characters are like, tropes of resistance movies or, German occupation movies, right? Like you've seen these characters before. The use of them kind of harks back to them. And also things like, the train or the escaping on a train, right? Or kind of the talk about going to the hills or the mountains, right? Kind of, and of course, the waiting around for a transit visa, right? Like, we know that from Casablanca, primarily, right? But the film very much harks back to that, whilst showing everything seemingly happening, like, all the other elements, the clothes, the cars, the setting, everything else is like contemporary Marseille, right?
And the fact that that this is based on a novel from 1944 says, it didn't take a whole history of cinema for us to get to the point where these were cliches. This is just the truth. This is like this is what was happening.
Yes.
And it's sort of, it may have become a cliche is not the right word because that sounds derogatory. It may have become a sort
of. That's why I said tropes instead. Yeah.
Better word. Yeah. They may become tropes of this period and of these stories, but they're not based on nothing.
Yeah.
And I think they're very effective. And I think one of the reasons that the fascist occupation in this film is so convincing, it's not just plausible, it's actually very convincing, is that it focuses just on these details of how people live their lives, and actually for the most part how people live their lives in places that are not being occupied, are yet to be occupied. It's being set in Marseille, and so you see very early on, while the action's still in Paris, riot police kind of trolling the streets and putting people up against walls and patting them down and so on. And that's the kind of that in terms of sort of the sort of extremes of the fascist occupation, that's kind of as much as you see, really.
Well,
Once the action's removed to Marseille, it's in scuttlebutt, and it's in fear, and it's in people talking about what's going to happen.
Yeah, but there are also things that you see, right? So, you see people dying waiting for visas, right? Like, that guy who's wanting to go to South America and presumably has a heart attack that kills him.
Yeah, he's a composer or something, isn't he?
Oh, yeah, a musician of some kind, yeah. And of course, you see, like, the sheer hopelessness that, kind of someone jumps off a bridge, right? When they know that, like, kind of the cleansing has now arrived to Marseille, right? And actually, and that was a kind of, again, one hears stories like this, right? Because, if you've already heard what's in store for you, so this woman kind of, who's been taking care of dogs while waiting to get a transit visa, has the dogs killed, treats herself to a fantastic meal, gets company, and then, like, kind of very surprisingly,
shares a cigarette and throws herself
off a bridge.
And I wasn't expecting it.
I wasn't expecting that either.
No, but as soon as it happens, it makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense, right? So actually, there are all those moments of violence or intimations of violence. There's kind of, this sense of danger.
But I think that does speak to what I'm saying about that being kind of separate from the direct occupation, which is still happening elsewhere. It speaks to this is what people's fears are, and this is what people's behaviour is when they know it's coming.
I think it speaks to both then and now, right? So, when the woman has to go away to live clandestinely with Driss, with the boy, right? And then he knocks on the door, and the door opens, and there are like 25 people living in one room. That's recognizable, So I think, that's the beauty of this film, that it's kind of, it's putting the past in play with the present, and it's making you it's drawing your attention to the present, kind of, into the situation of fascism in Europe, which kind of seems to be spreading, right?
At one or 2 points, I thought, you could have done this better by setting it in post-Brexit Britain. Like, there are things that wouldn't have seemed out of place in what we kind of imagine.
Well, my God, yes, Windrush and all those things. I mean, certainly it kind of...
I don't mean that to sound glib, I really mean it, okay, fascists walking down the street, maybe not, but in terms of the, people lining up at consulates and offices trying to get what they need done, I mean, that's already happening.
And people being kicked out,
exactly.
And people kind of, having their rights removed. We are now, September the 15th, and I personally kind of, don't know what my legal situation in this country is going to be on October 31st after living here for 27 years, So, I mean, to me, these things do not seem far-fetched at all, and they certainly do not seem exaggerated, right? And people say, oh, it'll never happen here, but then, like Priti Patel says, well, on the 31st of October, bye-bye, everything changes. Then, of course, she's told off, legally for saying that because it's outrageous, and then she's got to backtrack it. But, if you're one of those 3 million people kind of, who are EC citizens, and now you don't know what's going to happen, those comments from a government minister are, like, really terrorizing. Right, because it puts in place some of the situations that you see here, But nonetheless, so let me not, because the fact is that, I am here legally, but there are kind of lots of other people rendered stateless for many reasons, that kind of are in exactly the situation that is described in this film. Yeah, now, and that is kind of beyond Brexit. It has to, it's more like geopolitical, like, kind of. I mean, what happens if your country's a war, right? Like, where do you go or where do you flee, right? And what happens when there's, like, ethnic cleansing, the way that we saw in, like, the former Yugoslavia. Like, like if you're on the wrong side, like if you're a Muslim living in a, in a Christian area or a Christian living in a Muslim area, and kind of there's ethnic cleansing as a government policy. Where can you go to, right? Like, or if you're rendered stateless by your own government, which often happens, right? Look at what's happening in the United States, right? Like, so these things are very live, and the film kind of beautifully dramatizes them gives them emotional resonance, and kind of complicates them. It doesn't, so if yesterday I was saying, how it has a simple, stupid conception of what it is to be human and what the world is like, this actually has, a kind of a complex understanding of that, and actually a more generous view of looking at it. You can understand why people might make decisions that do not, seem admirable initially, right? And you see people struggling with their conscience and with their self-interest, and and giving up their self-interests, right, for other people. It's a film it's a film of misplaced love, right? So basically, this is a film in which the young boy forms an attachment with Georg, who also has an attachment for him, but is going to leave him. Right, and this doctor is going to leave Marie even though he loves her, but then he can't, right? And Marie has been waiting for her husband, who she thinks is alive, and has refused to take a ship that will make her safe because she's waiting for him, right? And so you get kind of is it Richard the doctor?
Yes.
And Georg are both in love with Marie. Kind of, you feel that you feel that Marie has an attachment to the husband, right? And then also a different kind of attachment or a tenderness for these two different men, right? Things are just like not clear cut. If you love this person, how can you not love another, right? And the question of the situation and context and comfort and need all play out as kind of part of this dynamic in a way that I think is really beautiful. I mean, I was very touched.
The film has been described, it's on the poster, it's a quote from IndieWire, as Casablanca as written by Kafka. And it's something that was on my mind through the film. It is quite glib. The Casablanca connection, I think, is absolutely apt, as we've both been saying. The idea, the kind of removing the action to this port people pass through and all this kind of thing, and there's all this concentration on visas and travel documents and so on and so forth, and then there's this sort of love triangle. Well, it's more than a triangle. It's, as you say, it's love in all different directions, but never the right direction. The Kafka reference in that quote is something I find too reductive, too glib, and actually not accurate, because what Kafka sort of says to me is the absurdity of the system, and how the system seems designed to kind of hold you up and confuse you, and there's sort of absurdity in everything, and there's the one point in the film where I think it actually is apt, where he's talking to the hotel owner right at the start, and she says she wants to see his documents, his travel documents or whatever it is, and he basically says, so in order for me to be able to stay, I have to prove I'm going to leave. Yes. That's the sort of catch-22 thing.
Well, but everything that is bureaucratic is not Kafka.
Exactly. I was going to say, like, everything that is bureaucratic actually seems to show the system working, really. Although, as you say, the one man does die in the queue, and there are large queues. Every time you see Georg talking to one of these consulate officials, they're doing their jobs quite well, it seems, asking him the right sort of questions and getting the information that they need to get.
No, but they're also overwhelmed, and actually he's getting privileged treatment because he's meant to be a famous writer.
Yes.
So, he gets through, but everybody else is waiting and waiting, right?
That's true.
So,
but still, it's not about about sort of an absurd system kind of holding you back or destroying your life.
Well, I mean, and it's not even absurd. I was going to say what's absurd is, that somebody could just waltz into your room and, basically put your life in danger, right? Like, so that seems absurd, like, except it's not, right? That bit where they go into the hotel and he gets off because he's managed, he's got an identity, right? False as it is. But the wife is separated from the husband and the child, and dragged through the corridor
with everyone watching.
So you'd say, oh well, that's absurd. Except it's not. It's systematic. It's again, it's an example of what the Nazis did, and who knows how that's happening now. I mean, just think of
that was the part of the film that affected me the most. Actually, you talk about it being moving, and I wasn't that moved by the love story really at all. But that part of the film where she's dragged through and everyone is watching and no one does anything.
And they talk of shame.
The narration talks of shame. He says, at that point, everyone was showing some emotion, shame.
Right.
And actually, that was one of the points where I felt that the narration was overbearing, because I thought you don't need to spell this out.
Oh, I think you do, because if what you're saying is that the film is making a connection between the past and the present, then this notion of shame is very important, because this notion of just looking on and letting things happen is what we're doing now.
Yes, but I think, well, in that case, it sort of acts as more of a call to action than just a dramatisation, I suppose, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that's kind of what it is, but because I felt you don't need a narrator to say everyone was feeling shame for me to understand through their gesture, through what their faces look like, through how they're looking and what they're looking at, and how you don't need all that on its own should be able to convey that.
Well, but for me it was important that it be underlined, because again, kind of, this is a film that's happening in between times, right? So I thought it needed to be underlined. If it's not just talking about the past, but it's also talking about the present, shame about what happened in the past is acknowledged. We've heard lots of German accounts, right? Beginning with "I didn't know," right? And then kind of a feeling of shame about what happened. But actually, what's happening now, I've never heard anybody speaking of shame in relation to that. So I liked that, that it was underlined, right?
Sure. Fair enough.
Wow.
A lot of the narration reminded me of this, I'm going to sound really lame now, but a TED Talk by a guy called Chip Kidd, who's a designer of book covers. It's really good and it's worth watching. And one of the things that he talked about is like the first lesson he had in the design school or whatever it was his teacher drew a picture of an apple on a board and wrote the word apple underneath it. And he said, you either show this or you write this. You don't do both. And that to me is what a lot of the narration does in this. It shows and tells at the same time.
No, you see, I mean, you could make that argument, and it's certainly true in cinema, right, that things kind of must be shown, right? But I think this is doing kind of stuff that's more interesting, and because again, we're saying the narration is unreliable. Like sometimes it's saying something that it's not showing you, or that it's showing you something else.
So it has to be boringly reliable for the unreliable stuff to be interesting.
Well, I think that the film is doing something interesting with choosing, when it's underlining, and when it's contradicting, or when it's not even contradicting, but it doesn't quite add up, or it doesn't quite do what it says.
Yeah. Right.
So kind of, so I think all of those things open up kind of areas of thinking, and of thinking about the action that you see, right? That are also kind of a bit mysterious. For example, after he finds out, or no, Marie comes in to the restaurant, and then he runs to the ship station to look at the passenger list to see whether she got on it or not. Was it his imagination? Was it a vision? Was it a dream? Right? Like, it turns out that, she was ostensibly there and sank, but was she, Or did she give her ticket to somebody else who used the same name? I mean, it just opens up kind of, nuances, complexities.
What did you make of the last shot of the film?
Remind me.
The last shot is he's been to the company, to the ship company, and looked at the manifest and has been told that she died, or been told that the ship sank. And then he's back at the cafe, sitting on his own as normal, and it's a shot on his face, and you hear the bell go as the door opens,
as the
and
occupation.
He looks up and smiles. Cut to black.
So that might be her, yes.
The idea is that might be her, and I must say I've never been a fan of that sort of ending. The only one I've ever liked like that is the end of The Dark Knight Returns, The Dark Knight Rises rather, the third Batman film, because it's all about it's the one where spoilers I suppose, Alfred, Michael Caine, has said earlier You know, I imagine you not being Batman anymore, going to a lovely little cafe in Italy where I always go every year, and I imagine you sitting there, and we wouldn't say anything to each other, but we just acknowledge that we're there, and we'd smile, and that's it. And then the end of the film, he's there in that cafe, and he looks up, and he sees Batman, and then importantly, we see Batman as well, and he's happy and stuff. And it's like, you know, don't make it ambiguous. Just show me that they're happy. You know. I get why it's not like that here. I get why it's never like that normally, but it feels like a cop out of an ending to me whenever something like that happens.
No,
Tell me what happened.
No, I like that ambiguity. Anyway, I think it's a really great film.
I must say, despite not being moved by things that I think I was supposed to be moved by, I think it's a really impressive film. And a really kind of bold film as well. And I mean, it reminded me as well of Die Welle, which we watched not long ago, which is another sort of modern. I say modern in terms of when it's made. It was from 2009 or so. Another German film talking about Germany's history. And as we say, like this film is not directly about Germany's history, but it is partially. It's you know, in a wide sense, and it refers to a real occupation, and you know, may displace it in time, but as you say, it sort of, that doesn't matter. Do you think it's especially interesting for that reason, for it being of German origin, the film?
Yes, it is, and it has a very, you know, so I wouldn't say it's an apology. But, you know, basically the things that happen in Germany, or that Germany caused, in the, you know, from the 30s, you know, until the end of the war, right? It's something that Germany has been held responsible for, made to pay for, born kind of questions of responsibility and shame, as well the country should, right? But the thing is, it's happening everywhere else now, right? Yeah, and actually kind of people, or very few people, are resisting or talking about it in the same way, right? It's okay if, you know, the people kind of seeking refuge are African or Middle Eastern. Yeah, it's not the same. Yeah, actually, you know, in many ways it is exactly the same. Yeah, kind of people are being hounded out for the same reasons, right? You know, so I think that a German is saying that is important, yes.
I think that
my theory might not be right about why, but you know,
I think that the French setting and the German characters and all the stuff that is so clearly related to the real sort of history on which this is based, and the novel on which it is based. I think that's one of the reasons that I do find it so convincing as a sort of world to believe in, because it struck me. What struck me as a point of comparison was Children of Men. And what Children of Men does, it talks about quote-unquote modern day, a sort of dystopian near future Britain. And it does so in painting a very broad picture. Like I say, this film focuses on those little details of how people interact and how people feel, and shows not so much of kind of imagery of fascist occupiers and so on, which Children of Men absolutely does. It builds a really rich dystopian world where you're constantly seeing areas of kind of dilapidation, lines of people being lined up by these kind of stormtroopers, basically that sort of thing, but Children of Men, I think for that reason, is like, it's very clearly not set in this real world. It's set in a sci-fi, not sci-fi, but dystopian, different world. This feels absolutely set in the real world. Yes. And I think that it's partially that concentration on details, and it's partially the setting in France with German characters and the close relationship it has to real historical events that is responsible for that.
Yes. I think it's important also that it happened in contemporary France, you know, because the narrative moving from the past to the present, you know, so ostensibly France is not under occupation. And for France, metaphorically read any rich Western country, kind of nobody's under an occupation, right? But these things, the things that you're being shown, are happening everywhere, and they're happening in countries that are not like, fascist dictatorships, right?
Do you think then that the film actually suffers from not being more directly about that?
No, I think it makes it richer, because it offers complexities, and it asks the audience to think about it. And I'm sure that everyone will have a slightly different interpretation of what those things signify. I can imagine some people rejecting it on that basis because it doesn't spell out everything for you, but if you meet the film halfway, it offers all this nuance and layers, that would not be there otherwise.
Something else which the film's talking about, which I don't have a good sort of read on, I suppose, at the moment, and we talked about it a little bit, is the idea of storytelling.
Yes.
So it's important that there is this narration which says Georg did this, Georg did that, and this happened and that happened, and it's quite poetic at points. And as you later find out it's the bartender who's been narrating this the whole time, but at the start you have no idea. Actually, the narration comes in when on that train down to Marseille, Georg opens the writer's bag and sees this unpublished manuscript. And as he's reading this manuscript, it being in German, I can't read a word of it, so I didn't know. But I thought that there may be an element of magical realism in here, where it turned out that the manuscript was somehow magically talking about his life, because it seemed like it was reading that out. And obviously the narration is talking about Georg. Quite fairly quickly disabused of that notion, because otherwise Georg would have had a much different reaction than just getting bored with it and putting it down. There's also, though, this thing about... I suppose I said earlier that Marie at one point tells her story, and that's a kind of central scene in the film. She tells her story to Georg. And there's also this thing about, at one of the consulates, it's the Mexican one, I think, Georg first meets one or two sort of characters who crop up later. This conductor is one of them, who tells him his story. He just starts talking. Georg doesn't say a word. He doesn't really seem to want to listen. But again, it does come through the narration, and this is something that the narration does express that isn't expressed visually, where Georg says, or rather the bartender narrating says, Georg realised that these people were telling their stories, and what are ports if not places for stories to be told? And everyone shares their story of why they're here. So the idea of storytelling and having your story, telling your story, but also having it heard. Is important. And there's this thing in the when he gets into the meeting with the sort of higher up in this consulate, and he's actually it's the American consulate. He says, "Are you going to write about this?" And he says, "I don't want to write." And he goes, "But a writer writes." Well, he comes up with this confabulation about why he doesn't want to write.
Because they wouldn't have accepted him if he were a communist. So it's almost like he's got, not writing is what gives him the visa. So, but it's true. There's all this thing about storytelling and hearing stories and telling stories, and and actually denying people's existence by not being willing to hear their story. So if you remember the woman who commits suicide, is like, I don't want to hear your story also.
Yes. I didn't commit at all.
I just want you to be here, right?
That's right. I just want company.
I just want company. I don't want to hear your story. So this thing about telling stories is absolutely crucial to identity and to existence and to acknowledgement of, historical kind of conditions and consequences. So, and the film plays on it. Some stories are reliable, some are not. Some are from the past, some are things that people say, right? But yes, there are loops of storytelling and kind of, and that makes the film so interesting, because if it is like this interplay between the past and the present, right? And kind of, the film has this whole thing about storytelling and visual storytelling and the novel of storytelling and oral storytelling and, the need that people feel to tell their stories and to be heard and, and so on. It makes for a really kind of rich and interesting kind of intervention that I think is both political and poetic, right? Like, this film is saying something about our times, and
There's also an idea in it, particularly thinking about that American consulate official, in that storytelling can be dangerous, powerful.
Yes, that's right.
The idea that, as you say, that they're worried that he's a communist. He has this. The writer, this is who he's taking the identity of, has this communist past, and Georg is very quick to sort of deny it and say anything he can to convince this guy that he's not a communist and not a threat. And one of the things that he says is, "I don't want to write about this. I have no intention of writing about this." And he has to come up with this idea why. And actually, in doing so, he kind of writes. I mean, the story that he tells me about when I was at school, we used to have to write essays on what was our summer like, what was our Christmas like, my best day of my summer. I got sick of it. I'm not going to write another essay. That is a kind of act of writing, and it's actually a really brilliant lie.
It is an act of writing, though. One of the interesting things about this film as well is that the central character, Georg, is the one that you almost know less about
than anyone. He's a cipher. He's someone to read things onto,
or to comment on other people's things. But you don't know where he's from. You don't know what he's doing in Paris. You don't know where he's going to. So you're told, yes, this guy's his friend, but how did he get in this mess? Where has he come from? What are they doing in Paris? Where does he want to go? Right? So the only thing that kind of is that he develops feelings both for the child, right, and for the woman. Yeah. And and things that happen to him or that he does. But actually he's a bit of a cipher.
Yeah. And I think it's a real credit to the film that I didn't question that until now.
Okay.
So, to credit to, more specifically, his characterization and the performance and the way his character is built and what he does, being like, that is what's interesting, and never really questioning where it's from or anything. Like, it's not. Maybe it's a question that you might ask, but it's not a problem. You don't feel like the film is lacking for not explaining who he is.
I think it's deliberate, right? And I think it adds a layer of richness, really. Yeah, but you agree that it is...
Yes, absolutely.
Kind of, it's almost like you know less about him than any of the other main characters. The doctor... who's got a contract in Mexico where he's really needed, and he's in love with this woman, and he's already delayed the trip, and you have both a sense of kind of where he's from, where he's going to, kind of what he feels, Whereas with Georg, it's like he's the protagonist, but actually you know less about him. You know less about him than you know about Marie. Right,
And there are definitely art films. I mean, I'm just racking my brain to think of them now, but there are definitely examples of sort of art films where you have your main character who doesn't talk very much, doesn't do very much, and really is a very deliberate sort of blank surface. But it always, in those films, I wish I could think of one right now. But in those films, it always comes across as so stilted that that's happening, and it doesn't here. You are given enough to understand just his state of mind.
Yes.
And what he cares about, and sort of where he's going. But there is a sense of sort of pieces on a chessboard being moved around, but to no great effect in kind of what happens. Certainly once he actually moves to Marseille, kind of affections are generated between people, and then that kind of informs why a visa might be given to someone, or a transport document might be given to someone, and you have these kind of ideas of plans that are tentatively being put in place on which boat will travel on, where we'll travel to, who I'll travel with.
Yes.
But that's constantly changing, and when it changes and changes back, it's never to any kind of great effect. There is this sense of sort of just, as I said, like pieces being moved around a chessboard, but no
also
piece being taken.
It's a little bit more than that in the sense that you're also very quickly told or made conscious of the time is running out, right?
Yeah.
So if they don't get this boat, there will not be another boat. That the Germans are approaching. They've already done Paris and Lyon and Avignon, and kind of there might be no more boats leaving, right? So the sense, it's not quite a deadline, but you get a sense of the urgency of acting quickly, of time running out, right? Which is done very subtly because, it's not as like some classic American film where you're given a deadline and you're constantly reminded of it, and But actually here
it's not how Hitchcock would have done it.
Exactly. But it's a weight that overhangs these characters, that time is running out for them, right? Which is
Although you'd think they would act a little bit more urgently. They do seem to still be a little bit lackadaisical sometimes.
No, but what can you do? I mean, this is not an action movie. I mean, what would you do in real life? They wait around kind of consulates and, and then try to get kind of tickets and, look into the black market. And, those are the things that actually you see them doing. And they're all dreary and boring and dull and, but they lead to suicide.
I'd say the one character I wanted to know more about is Driss's mother.
Ah, yes.
I feel like I wanted to know more about her. You are given sort of enough to understand vaguely why she is where she is. And I think it's interesting, it's very deliberate that when Georg goes back to her apartment and discovers that she's moved, what he discovers there is about 25 either North African or Middle Eastern or both people. Like there seem to be a number of families.
They look like Moroccan
staying
as well.
in the same place.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. Like you kind of get the sense that this is a place where people of that ethnic background or those ethnic backgrounds are welcome.
Well, I don't know, because I think for me the casting of that mother is so significant because had you cast her as a blonde, the film would have had a different resonance. I mean, I think one of the things that the film is trying to do is kind of make it resonate in the present. Right, and so to have, that skin color, right, and the reference to being North African in this film is one of the things that again kind of links it to the present. Because like a person like that, unless she was a Roma, wouldn't have been in danger in Marseille in, 1942, right? So, but that person without papers would be in danger now, right? So I think kind of, that's one of the film is very clever in kind of how do you go about making these connections.
And it struck me as well, and I don't have a good read on this at all, that she is deaf and mute.
Yes.
And her son translates for her. You don't actually know this at the start. Georg says something to her, and it's only when she looks at her son to translate what he's just said you realise that that she can't hear. And the film moves fairly fluidly between French and German. The Germans speak to each other, and then they speak to French characters in French, and that's very, very fluid. And then for these couple of scenes with the mother, it moves into sign language.
Yes.
And there is this focus on when he's explaining to her why Driss has let him in to the apartment because she wasn't there at the time, and sort of explaining what he does and who he is and that sort of thing. You have to take the time to say it and then wait for it to be translated and then say it back. And then she asks him to sing this song that he'd been singing to Driss.
Yes,
and he sings it. She wants to watch him sing.
Yes. And actually that moment stumped me, because that is a moment where you are given information about his past, right? It's a song that his mother sang to him. I'm not familiar enough with German culture to know the cultural resonances of that song.
Yeah, I didn't know the song.
You suspect that this song signifies something, right?
The song is about a number of animals coming home. The codfish swims home. The cow comes home. The horse comes home.
Yes.
That's all the lyrics.
Okay, so in a I suppose in a blatant sense, these are now characters without a home that have had to escape their home, right, to survive. That have had to leave home to survive. But I suspect there's something more to it than that. Like, was this a popular children's song in the 1930s? Right? Yeah. Does it have some kind of connection to like Nazi Germany? Yeah. I mean, those are the things I just don't know. But you feel that, that kind of lullaby has more resonance than just about home. Yeah, like, yeah.
And I really loved the idea of her asking him to sing it, wanting to watch him sing, because I suppose you get the sense. I mean, I'm working on this as I think about it. Like, you get the sense that she is isolated through her deafness and her inability to speak.
Like so many migrant peoples, from economic immigrants to other types of migrants, because that is often the case, that people can't speak the language and they can't understand things. but they can see.
Well, you've spoken before about being in Montreal as a child.
Yes.
You would have to speak on behalf of your parents.
That's right. They didn't speak the language, so you often have children translating for their parents. From everything, from putting a phone in or,
And that's absolutely what's happening here, except she's even more isolated because it's not like she can speak to other North Africans, wherever it is exactly that she's from. She can only speak through her son.
Yes.
And all of the love story stuff between all that cast of characters is about, in a very broad sense, connection. I suppose every film really, in some sense, is about connection.
Yes.
But this is about connection. She can't hear a word he's saying, but in watching him sing to her, she's able to kind of reach outside for a type of connection with someone else. He's doing it for her, speaking to her, and that kind of transcends her disability. And actually, I found that quite moving.
That was very moving, actually.
Food for thought.
Yes. Well, I highly recommend that people see it.
Yeah, so do I.
And actually, again, just to say, we saw it at the MAC at the Midlands Arts Centre with their wonderful projection system, which always helps. So, do see it if you get the chance. And we are eavesdropping at the movies, and we are on
YouTube, SoundCloud, and iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, whatever it's called. I don't have an iPhone, so I don't know.
Right. iTunes?
iTunes, something like that.
I have an iPhone.
On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter, at Eavesdrop Movies is the handle, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Right, thank you very much for listening.
Auf Wiedersehen.
All right, goodbye. There's this thing about the ships that they hope to get to America with, right? And so the Montreal, right? And they have this huge cruise ship, which is like, what was it? Something Doria, the one that crashed in Italy. You remember a few years ago?
Began with C, didn't it?
Sorry?
Didn't begin with C, the name of that ship. I'm sure we're thinking of the same thing. Cruise ship that crashed. I'll have a quick look.
What's it all? Anyway, it looks like the Andrea Doria or whatever it was. You have to take all this out.
Well, the Costa Concordia.
The Costa Concordia, yeah.
See, it was worth looking it up.
Yes, good. Well, I had it in mind. I was not far off.
And now our listeners can have it in mind too.
No, this must all come off.
Not all of it. We're going to keep in the name Costa Concordia.
Okay, well, so now we say, that there's an allusion, an explicit reference made to the Costa Concordia.
You act like I've never had to cut anything out you've ever said before. Carry on.
Anyway,